Hi everyone, this is the recording for Friday, April 16. I am going to start sharing my screen so I can pick up where I left. So this is it. Last time on Wednesday, we left here talking about the structural constraints in agriculture. And this is just adding to the already extensive list of problems and challenges faced by agriculture in Latin America. So we concluded with the fact that politicians in Latin America don't see agriculture as the future. They see it as a declining sector that should belong to the past, and that Latin American countries in this quest for modernization should move on and look into the future. I also mentioned that another problem that the rural poor face is that being in remote locations with poor access to communications, not just roads, but also electricity and things that you need to communicate with things that here we take for granted, like, you know, the internet or radio or phones. Well, in some Latin American countries, they don't have that. Because of all these things, they don't have a lot of political power because we don't hear them, we don't see them. They don't have a significant political presence at the discussion tables. So the power that they may have is just not there. We also talk about that how the policies that have significant impact on these groups normally come from centralized offices. And by this, I mean people without the knowledge and the experience necessary to make decisions in the best interest of these groups, mainly because for the most part, they have never visited, they have never been into these communities. So you may have engineers in agronomy, you may have people in biology that perhaps they have the best interest at heart in terms of helping. But when you don't really know what's happening there because you have never been there, and you are behind a desk, you are, you know, wearing a tie or a white coat without going into the field, it's very hard to understand and therefore very challenging to produce the proper decisions. And also we talk about credit, the poor access to credit that these poor communities have. And this is important because unfortunately, when they don't have access to formal credit because of high risk, because of lack of property rights, or a combination of these and other factors, alternative markets for credit develop. I'm talking about loan sharks and, you know, people that have accumulated or have a significant amount of cash, and they say, all right, I am going to give you a loan, but the interest rate is obviously much higher than what they could otherwise get into the formal financial system. And worse, in many occasions, in many cases, if they are unable to pay the loan, the sharks, these alternative lenders of money, are way more aggressive in terms of taking over land and taking repossessing properties and things like that. So it's a very challenging situation. But anyway, this is basically where I left, and I was going to move on into this new section. By the way, this may be a shorter than usual class, you know, less than 50 minutes. I don't know how long it's going to take me to cover this, but I just don't want to start a new section on human resources, or human capital rather, until Monday when we are together, because I really want to create a good foundation for what's coming. But anyway, if it takes me 30 minutes or whatever, that's fine. Once again, it's Friday, and I'm sure you have other fun things to do. But okay, so I don't want to put this in writing, and it's not in writing, but you may have an idea that, based on my discussion so far, that the agricultural sector has been broken or is broken in Latin America, right? So what have been some of the policy recommendations to fix it, to repair, to make it better? So you have obviously a spectrum of recommendations with different approaches. The typical neoliberal approach follows the following recipe. Well, obviously, securing property rights, transferable property rights, basically titles of property, or mainly titles of property. But also they talk about making sure that every person in rural areas have an identity, a legal identity, IDs, so that they can identify themselves, and together with the titles of property, they can access the formal financial system. And also this is going to allow for the transfer of property, formal transfer of property, land or otherwise, cars, equipment, machinery, buildings, farms, across individuals, but all of these within a very legal, well-structured, functioning system, which right now is just not existent. This is going to stimulate markets. This is going to stimulate a more legal environment, and that's a very important ingredient for the success of capitalist economies, for market-based economies, which is tied to the second thing, which has to do with enforceable contracts. We need to create the legal infrastructure capable to oversee all these transactions, not just in urban areas, which we have in Latin America, but in rural areas as well. And enforceability implies, well, what happens if for some reason there is a breach of contract, or somebody is breaking the law in some way? Well, there must be some sort of authority and the mechanism for correction of those type of behaviors. In many Latin American countries, there are laws in some cases, but the mechanism to enforce the law is not clear. I already mentioned that in some communities, when there is a conflict, sometimes, not very frequently, but it's not rare to see that people, rather than going to the police department, they go to the church. They don't look for the sheriff or the chief of police. They look for the priest, because the level of trust in the government institutions is so poor that they prefer a different type of authority for dispute resolution issues. Another interesting aspect that neoliberal policies imply is the removal of subsidies, at least for those countries that are able to provide some subsidies, not a single one in Latin America at the scale of the subsidies that the US and other rich economies can provide to their farmers. But certainly in a way to, in an effort to counterbalance some economies, including Mexico, the large economies in Latin America, Brazil, Argentina, Chile, Mexico, and perhaps a couple of others, have been able over time to build some resources to subsidize their farmers. Sometimes it's technical assistance, sometimes through access to cheaper fertilizers or cheaper seeds and things like that. Well, the neoliberal agenda says, well, you don't want to mess with the price mechanism, because it's the compass of the economy. Subsidies and taxes distort this price mechanism. They make the compass of the economy to not to work properly, and therefore you shouldn't do that. So once again, this is an interesting idea, and I wouldn't be against necessarily if the rich economies of the world were also removing their subsidies. So once again, unfortunately, they preach but they don't practice these recommendations, and that is a problem for Latin American countries. Obviously, they are in favor of market-based type of initiatives versus command and control regulations. And again, this is obviously on the neoliberal camp. Green accounting methods, peer monitoring, co-signing to reduce risk, and of course, a greater push to international trade. So in the mind of these people, and at some extent, with some truth behind, if farmers want to take advantage of economies of scale in production, distribution, commercialization, and all of these things that are on the value added, high profit margin side of the equation, they need to open up to international trade, because in many economies in Latin America, the size of the population, the size of the market is so small that they are never going to reach these economies of scale level. They need to start producing in mass. They need to produce large amounts so that they can actually reduce the average total cost, therefore reaching economies of scale, and they being able to take advantage of these benefits. The problem, obviously, once again, is that although in theory sounds very nice, because it assumes true international free trade, in reality, we don't have that, despite the fact that we have the WTO and all of these trade agreements and all of these laws and regulations governing international trade. Is not free from government intervention. And that's what I mean. When I say free trade, I mean free from government intervention. Once again, in the case of the US, we provide a huge amount of subsidies to farmers, which enables them to reduce cost and therefore dump agricultural stuff all over the world, not just Latin America. Dump meaning selling to Latin American countries below cost. And that's the typical straight definition of dumping, which again shouldn't be happening, but it is happening. The institutional approach, they focus more on, they do not necessarily oppose the neoliberal, as we have seen before, but they add, for example, the importance of reducing the high transaction cost, particularly in the credit markets. It's very expensive for small farmers to have access to credit because, well, they represent a higher level of risk. The quality of the collateral, if any, is much lower, and many other complications that increase the transaction cost and therefore is very costly to small farmers. The structuralist approach, remember the ECLAC and CEPAL, these guys are still around, and they emphasize the importance of taking into account classes and gender. In the mind of these people, it's very important to understand that there are cultural elements, sociological, anthropological elements that shape up the nature of markets. It's not just about price and quantity. It's not just about increases in demand and increases in the supply and elasticities. All of this is happening, but this is just the technical part of the functioning of the markets. There is something underneath. There is something deeper that, like I said, is morphing and shaping the way the markets work. Sometimes for good, sometimes not so much. So if you don't consider the role of women, if you don't consider the role of children, in labor markets, if you don't consider the fact that powerful groups are able to influence policies that are going to impact markets in their favor, and many other considerations that have to do with the structure and the underlying structures of markets, things are not going to work. Things are not going to work because you may have a very free market, a very well-organized market. You may have access to credit. You may have, you probably remove subsidies. They are ready to open to international. All of these things are in place, but guess what? The benefits are not going to be distributed equally if you don't take into account classes and gender and traditions and history and behaviors and other attitudes and other elements that normally are totally absent in the neoliberal rhetoric. And finally, there is this recommendation about land reform. This basically is a collection of ideas that have to do with, again, making sure the property rights are clearly defined, but also there is this conversation that sometimes becomes violent, at least has turned violent in some countries, about a redistribution of the land. That so that, you know, rather than allowing a few families to control massive amounts of terrain that sometimes go idle because they don't have the capacity to administer, you know, acres and acres, thousands of acres. You know, the idea is that to figure out mechanisms for redistribution. So rather than letting some pieces of land going idle, and, you know, being subject to erosion and the depletion of the nutrients and all of these important elements for agriculture, we should figure out a way to reorganize, redistribute, and parcel things out so that everybody is responsible for something, and we can take advantage of not just 80 or 70% of the arable land, but 100% with benefits for everybody in more and guarantee a more equal distribution. And when I say violent, well, for some of you that know some history, for example, in the case of Mexico, the Mexican Revolution, which is not independence, I'm talking about the equivalent of the Civil War in the US. So it's an internal conflict, but in Mexico, they call it the Mexican Revolution. In a way, at least partially began as this quest, at least in the southern states, for this redistribution of the land. And of course, you know, the revolution took place, and in a way it was quite successful because, in fact, many rich people were dispossessed of their lands, and they were given to poor people, and it was, in a way, again, successful in that sense. However, I should say that for reasons that are difficult to explain and actually difficult to understand, over time, the same families, 2, 3, 4 generations after, that used to own the land are in the process of recovering, amassing all this land back again, reacquiring it. And I don't know, again, this is a very interesting phenomena. This has to do with, okay, they may have lost the land for 2 or 3 generations, but the power they had politically and economically, they kept, and that's how they are able to recover what they lost. Anyway, the point is that there is a series of policies and recommendations by different groups based on different approaches. But there are many questions that remain. You know, what is the optimal size of a farm? Do we want many small farms, or just a few really large farms? Or we want mid-sized farms? Who is going to have access to credit and how, to technology? What type of technologies? Pay for labor, what type of land should be used and what type of land should be saved for, you know, biodiversity and rotation of crops. There is, I mean, like I said, this is a topic where we can, you know, go deeper and deeper and deeper, and we can spend the entire semester speaking about agriculture. So We don't have time to do that. This is just, although we are deeper than before, still a relatively superficial conversation. We have talked about this a little bit already regarding important forces and important trends shaping up contemporaneous agricultural sectors in Latin America. For example, there is this technological gap. Policies, unfortunately, at least the ones that have been implemented so far, tend to favor access to technology in favor of commercial farmers, not so much small peasant farmers. And this has to do, once again, with credit, understanding of science and other things. The point is that this has been widening, this gap in terms of access and understanding of technology has been widening over time. I don't know how to, it's hard because I'm mirroring my image, like this. Is widening access to technology, and that just is increasing the productivity gap between large corporate farmers and small peasant farmers. I don't have examples right now, numerical examples, but in some cases the yield for corporate farmers can be 3, 4, 5 times higher than traditional farmers, which is like abysmal, right? It's huge. Can you imagine in the same acre, a large corporation can produce 5, 6 more times than a regular farmer in a normal peasant farm? It's huge. The other issue is that traditionally in Latin America, farming has been very familiar, very local based, very human centered. Now, with the impetus behind globalization, neoliberal policies, pro-market reform, the relationship among farmers and the relationship between the farmer and the land and the farmer and technology and all the main actors has changed. Now is less human-centered. Now is less personal. Now is more about, is more business-like, more impersonal. Market forces dictate what needs to happen because that's what is going to make them more efficient. And unfortunately, this has created opportunities for exploitation, subordination, and other ill form or different forms of relationships, which takes me to the next one, which has to do with the fact that tenant workers have been replaced by wage workers. And I already explained this before. So this means that farmers that used to work in the land but own the produce now work in the same land sometimes, but for a wage, for a salary, and they don't own what they produce. This is owned by the corporation that is employing them. And finally, they already spoke about this, the feminization of agriculture. Females are more readily available, more willing to work on a seasonal basis, and also willing to accept lower wages, particularly those, like I explained on Wednesday, that have been left behind by their counterparts, their spouses, when they migrate to the cities in the same country or cities in other countries, when they migrate internationally. So what is the challenge? What is the main challenge for agriculture here? Well, I'm just reducing this whole discussion to a very few words, and that's probably not very healthy for critical thinking, but for practical purposes, I think it helps. So this is the thesis. The challenge is to create, I'm just reading here, equitable pathways to raising farm productivity. Okay, what does that mean? Just 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 words. To create equitable pathways to raising farm productivity. So in essence, the way I see it is that we need to figure out how to incorporate all these market forces, efficiency-driven recommendations into agriculture to increase productivity, but at the same time, making sure that the benefits of this increased productivity, which include everything, access to technology, access to credit, all of these property rights, all of these things that we have discussed, that the benefits of these increases in productivity, and by that I mean yield increases, the number of metric tons per acre, or whatever you want to, however you want to measure a yield or productivity, the benefits of those things have to be distributed in a more equitable way, rather than being concentrated in just a few large corporate farms. I don't know if you understand what I'm talking about here, and I don't have a way to gauge that because you are not here, but at least not in lifetime with me. But this is a very huge challenge. It seems like, okay, what's the problem? You know, but believe me, this is something that has been tried in many occasions, not just in Latin America. I'm talking about South Asia, African countries, and it's a big deal because it requires human capital development. Aha, that's a good connection with the next section that has to do with human capital. Remember, education and health, but also requires a significant amount of infrastructure, and we can talk about that too. I'm talking about, you know, roads so that small farmers can take their produce out, but also communications for literally, you know, communicating with the city, transportation, and other things that have to do with infrastructure, that have to do with schools, hospitals, farms, technical assistance, you know, islands, so that they don't have to go, you know, 300 miles away to get some idea about how to deal with a plague or how to use a fertilizer, many things. And also community-based decision-making. And that's a huge political challenge because in general, mostly in Latin, at least in general in Latin America, historically speaking, most of the decision-making, as I explained, has been centralized by people that have no idea what's happening in the community. Now we need to reverse that and make this decision-making community-based. Those present at those communities should be the ones making the decisions, because nobody knows best than these individuals what's best for them. So in essence, what I'm talking about is how to ensure that policy initiatives and recommendations to increase productivity in the rural sector are consistent with programs to improve the incomes of the rural poor. You see the link? So normally trickle-down economics says, okay, you just increase production, increase GDP, and automatically things are going, the benefits are going to trickle down to everybody in the population. Well, we know that that doesn't happen already. At the macro level, doesn't happen. Now, let's look at this particular sector, agriculture. Has this happened? No. Productivity has been rising so far in Latin America, and that has been something good. I'm not saying that that's nothing that we shouldn't be pursuing. I think that's good. The key that we have not able to find yet is how to make sure that all these increases in productivity and the benefits that this increased productivity brings are spread out in terms of higher income, higher opportunities, better education, better health, more human capital to those on the field to those in these rural communities. That has not happened. And that's, in my mind, one of the biggest challenges in Latin America right now. Remember, we're running out of time. We're running out of time because, as I mentioned on Wednesday, the discussion is not longer what type of entity they are going to be, like a feudal type of society or a capital. No. The discussion right now is, are these farmers going to survive? And if they don't survive, what's going to happen? You are going to see more migration to the cities, more migration to the US, more criminal activities, because essentially we are choking them. We're choking them, leaving them completely out of economic development. And of course, they have to find ways to survive. And unfortunately, sometimes those means are not, well, in the best interest of them or in the best interest of Latin America. Because some of them, once again, are illicit activities, drug trafficking, kidnapping, organ traffic, human traffic, and others, right? Or, once again, migration to the cities, which is going to increase the size of the informal sector with problems that we are going to discuss later, or migration to the US or other countries. So I really want to emphasize the fact that, as a matter of foreign policy and the conversations here in the US, we have to be very sensitive to these issues. If we want to be practitioners of critical thinking, and this is one of the goals in this program of economics, we need to at least consider that some of the policies implemented by rich nations like the US have been producing effects and impacts in Latin American countries like Mexico and other Central American countries that are producing some of the behaviors that we in the US complain about, like migration, right? Oh, these guys are coming to the US and they are taking jobs and they are not paying taxes and, all sorts of negative things. Well, but how many times have we stopped to think about that, at least partially, some of these things happening, like migration, are taking place because of the same policies that we have implemented and we have pushed through the IMF, the World Bank, all these neoliberal reforms, through the subsidies, through the tariffs and other, I'm talking about, when I say foreign policy, I'm talking about trade policy. I am also talking about, all these efforts to influence policy making in Latin America in the name of human rights and democracy and all of these things. We talk about, the coup d'etat in 1973 in Chile, when the US didn't like that, Salvador Allende, this leftist president, had been elected. So we didn't like it, and we just got rid of it. So anyway, I'm talking about so many things, but the point is that there is a link, and this is what I want to think about. There is a link between the decisions taking place in countries like the US, what's happening in Latin America, at least in agriculture, and the consequences in terms of behaviors and paths followed by Latin American people. So in a way, what I'm saying is that we are also part of the problem. Let me stop here for a second. For some reason, I see myself all shady or blurry, rather. Let me fix this. I think it's better. I don't know what's going on. There we go. Anyway, let me continue with this just to close. The last section, I don't even remember why I put this a couple of years ago, but this is still an interesting conversation. And this has to do with sustainability. And we're going to talk about sustainability later more extensively, but this is just one example of Brazil that took the lead in biofuels, alternative to gasoline. So biofuel is an ethanol in particular is important, an important example because it's relatively cheap, easy to manufacture and process, can be made for from very common things like corn, sugar, potatoes, and other things. And obviously, in this quest for alternative sources of energy other than oil that are renewable, well, think about agriculture. Unless we, spoil all the water in the world, which we could as human beings, because we haven't been very smart when it comes to water. But we have a renewable source in agriculture in terms of we can produce as much corn, as much sugar cane, as much potatoes that we need to produce ethanol. So Brazil understood that, and they took the lead. In 2005, he was the top producer of ethanol in the world. Brazil, remember, Brazil is one of those countries in Latin America that is leading the pack, together with Mexico at some extent. Brazil has its own airline company, a Brazilian airline manufacturing company. I already mentioned that Brazil has a seat in the space station, floating around Earth or orbiting the Earth. But anyway, actually, I have a picture here. And Brazil, by the way, is also producing cars that run fully on ethanol. The cars that we make in the US can run only partially with ethanol. So actually, if you look, I don't know the formulas right now, the percentages, but the gasoline that we use here in the US, in most cases, is a combination of a large percentage of typical gas and a smaller percentage of ethanol. Well, in Brazil, it's the opposite. They are already moving away from dependency on oil, and they're adopting, well, at least back then, 80% of the country's automotive fuel was coming from ethanol. The point is that I think the ethanol example provides a creative example and a creative path. And it came from Brazil, a Latin American country, not from a rich developed nations like the US or Germany or Japan. It's a Latin American country. And in a way, this has produced some benefits for a larger number of people, because corn and sugarcane that is widely produced in Brazil is also reaching the peasant farmers. So they get together and they collectively negotiate prices and quantities and delivery dates and delivery places within Brazil. No need to go to international markets, no need to deal with exchange rates. It's all domestic, And they are receiving, seeing some of the benefits already. I mean, this is not a magic bullet. This is not a solution to every problem. This is just one glimpse of what could be an interesting, creative way to start thinking about how to tackle this challenge that I already spoke about. Yeah. Okay, I'm gonna stop sharing. And as I said, I don't want to start a new section until Monday on human resource development. So I'm gonna stop here. Thank you, guys. I will see you in, well, a couple of days for me, or 3 days for me. I don't know, for you, maybe it's only 10 minutes because you're me watching the recording. Anyway, thank you, guys. See you soon.